Think back to a perfect cup of morning coffee. Feel your mug warming your hands awake. Imagine the sun, how it rises over the mountains just out the cafe's back window. The birds, they're chirping. Now isn't that nice? On days like these, the world as far as you can see it is in picture-perfect harmony. But now let's consider this. You order your coffee with an ounce of milk, but instead get a splash of political upheaval. Outside protests put Frankenstein's mob of angry villagers to shame. Prisoners are killed by civilians. Rakes turn to pitchforks. Pitchforks turn to weapons. War is all you can think about. Where did that picture-perfect morning go? Where are those birds? Where are you? You're in a place where God is leaned on more than government, but where people are governed more than God could even know. But how did you get here? You might wonder what political events led to this cluster of chaos, but what if the answer wasn't all in a memory or historical record, but rather on the end of your index finger? Yes, your index finger. That flimsy little digit that's capable of oh so much. It points to which donut you'd like this morning. It draws in the air as you do math to calculate how much to tip the cashier. It flicks off those pesky yellow sprinkles you still believe taste worse than the rest. And it hails for a cab when you're feeling too full to walk home. But you thought its role in the course of history ended there, somewhere between picking boogers and pointing at shooting stars. Never did you imagine that that finger could turn everything into this. You're at your computer, and instead of reading the long block of text before you, you decide simply to wonder, what am I consenting to with this innocuous click of the mouse? But never do you dare to put in the effort to find out. End-user license agreements are blind handshakes. A deal is struck not by one side's knack for negotiation, but rather by the other side's propensity for neglect. To humans, reading the fine print is more a phrase than an action. We've all heard it said, but have you ever seen it done? From making the bed to mowing the lawn, history is ripe with chores to complain about. But what is unique about this chore, reading end-user license agreements, is that it's met with no resistance. No moans or grievances. It's not pushed under the rug nor procrastinated. It's an anomaly in itself. It's simply ignored. Not how you ignore the noise of construction out your bedroom window at 7 in the morning. That type of ignoring takes a specific effort. A pillow thrown over your head and pressed into your ear. Not how you ignore late-night cravings for ice cream in bed. That takes discipline. We are not talking about an instance that forces upon us an act of discounting, but rather an anomaly that by nature is disregarded, scrolled by, thought nothing of. And let it be known that end-user agreements do not have the ego of humans. They do not take our indifference to them personally. In fact, they welcome it, reveling in their anonymity. While most ULA's agendas are widely understood to protect software licensors in the event said software crashes a computer, an unusual end-user license agreement, SCP-2221, has higher ambitions. This contract is not concerned with mitigating a few lawsuits. It aspires to more. As you scroll lower and lower, it subtly seeks to manipulate the minds, hearts, and souls of millions and millions more. This endless scrolling asked of you is by no mistake. Instances of SCP-2221, most often found by consumers of inexpensive or free software, are longer than most end-user license agreements, designed to lull us into a zombie state, not of reading, but of completing. The task of reading this particular kind of contract is so tedious that you no longer concern yourself with the minutiae between point A and point B. You just become obsessed with reaching the finish line. And it's within those moments of illiterate impatience that SCP-2221 knows to strike. First, leading with a jab, better known as Clause 189, which reads, "You agree that all worship, prayer, obeisance, sacrifice, oaths, requests for guidance and/or intervention, and any other invocations of divinity directed at any deity or deities listed in Appendix H-8 will instead be directed at Serene Tribune, friend of the righteous, hereafter referred to as amicus. Furthermore, you agree that this clause supersedes conscious intent with regard to the direction of the aforementioned invocations of divinity. Then SCP-2221 follows with an ever-formidable Clause 191. You agree that Friends of Amicus LLC may access your consciousness for the purpose of exerting subconscious influence and/or temporary control of consciousness for a period not to exceed 72 hours during any 1-week period. But SCP-2221 doesn't stop there, not before delivering one final blow, the knockout punch. Clause 216. You and Friends of Amicus LLC agree that any attempts to breach or modify the terms of this agreement, or to bring suit against Friends of Amicus LLC, must be settled by arbitration in the Serene Tribunal. And once these clauses are combed over and you hit agree, your free will throws in the towel, surrendering to SCP-2221, and yet, the battle has just begun. But first, it must be asked, how do you fight when you don't even know who it is that you're fighting, who is enforcing this contract? Pro tip, if you don't know what to do with your hands in a fight, it is never a bad idea to put your guard up. And that's what the Foundation first did. When word got out of SCP-2221, strict containment procedures were put into effect. Websites believed to host instances of SCP-2221 were isolated for examination, and civilian users were immediately blocked from such websites. A team of C-Class personnel were then assigned to the job of maintaining an ongoing search for websites and software that require users to agree to an end-user license agreement and thoroughly examine all such agreements for signs of SCP-2221. C-Class personnel spend hours a day in front of computer screens, scrolling through the tediousness of every end-user license agreement they could find. It was a never-ending job, like picking up trash on the beach, only to return the next day to find high tide has brought more. But at least a beach cleanup gives a fleeting feeling of reward to cherish and cling to. There is a moment where the sand looks uninhabited, cleansed of pollution. There is a moment where the sun sets over the horizon, and you can't help but think you contributed a small part to its beauty. But grinding away at the computer, scavenging for harmful clauses and EULAs is far more taxing than picking up trash. You don't need to toil over a littered candy wrapper to know to toss it in the garbage. SCP-2221, however, isn't recognizable at first glance. Each end-user license agreement took C-Class personnel several minutes to analyze before being able to categorize them as safe or harmful. Imagine a beach cleanup where every piece of trash must be sent to the lab before being thrown away. That's the task that was placed upon personnel, and thus they eventually came to realize their efforts to be futile. With strained eyes and carpal tunnel syndrome, they officially aborted their original containment procedures, understanding that the punches coming their way were too much for any two hands to block. Now, while analogizing SCP-2221 to a boxer throwing blows might be convenient, it only distances us from the truth of the matter. SCP-2221 is far more dangerous than any right hook. It does not stop for the bell. It is an onslaught stuck on repeat. With a defensive stance deemed unsuccessful, the Foundation had to pivot its approach. They had to change the way they saw the problem. And sometimes the best way to learn about a predator is to study its prey. Civilians who have accepted the terms of an SCP-2221 agreement are considered 2221-As, and it's in putting these 2221-As under the microscope of analysis that the Foundation began to find answers. This wasn't the Foundation's preferred method of study, as they would have rather experimented within the confines of their labs for reasons of safety and secrecy, but they struggled to effectively and accurately carry out tests to resolve their questions. Certain classes of individuals, like mentally incapable people and prepubescent children, are all unaffected by SCP-2221, even if they hit agree. The Foundation believes this is because they lack the legal capacity to agree to a contract. Beyond that, individuals incapable of understanding the contract, such as those who cannot speak the language in which it is written, or sleeping persons made to press the button to agree to the contract, are also unaffected by the terms of the agreement. These limitations have proven extremely disruptive when attempting to study SCP-2221. After all, you can't get too far along with your research if your lab rats are blessed with impunity. And so the Foundation moved deeper along their chain of proverbial lab rats, and they extended their research to D-Class personnel. The D-Class was instructed to read and agree to SCP-2221. This too, however, gave them no return on their scientific investment. The reasons for D-Class personnel's resistance to contractual obedience is uncertain, but that doesn't stop them from speculating. The Foundation, however, had little time to wonder. Their strategy to untangle this mess just led to more knots, and they needed to straighten things out. This time to do so, they decided to move beyond lab-driven research and focus on studying populations who have possibly been exposed to SCP-2221. When observing populations with frequently recurring 2221-As, the Foundation noted many odd yet consistent behaviors. First, they recognized increased voter turnout and political activism. People in passing wouldn't talk about sports, but instead propositions and ideas. Elections weren't just days of obligations marked on calendars. They were anticipated with enthusiasm. Their dates were etched in the minds of the collective, as if no different than the Super Bowl or New Year's Eve. The Foundation noticed populations dense with 2221-As had a palpable energy. It was like the end-user license agreement gave them a motor, an engine for action. If there were social or political issues on people's minds, they weren't just accepted as consequence of society, they were fought for. Cars were just as likely to be stopped by protesters as they were a red light. Politics in these areas were primitively efficient. The system was more condensed. People wanted something, and they did what they had to do to get it. There was no room for the performance of good manners in this political construction. If something was seen to be out of line, it was pushed back in. Churches began sprouting up like weeds, because while political involvement increased steadily, the authority of religion ran rampant. A shift in practice was observed, and it didn't take a microscope to see it. Religion was no longer held in the heart, hidden beneath personal belief, but it was a statement, worn like a designer jacket. It was a code for living. A code that 2221-As believed must be enforced. And so when civilians deviated from religious law, community punishment came with it. It was not uncommon to see sinners being shamed at the center of town squares. It was not uncommon for them to be ridiculed and guilted until they felt like nothing at all. And while showered with shame, they stood frozen like a statue, erected to remind others of what happens when they deviate from the law of God. But even humans playing statues weren't enough to quench 2221-A's thirst for religious art. These highly affected communities were noted also for their paintings. From the murals in churches, 2221-A dense populations glorified nooses and patterns resembling nooses with unnerving frequency. Even in the artwork that emits nooses, you will notice the necks of the subjects are slightly red and scratched, presumably to symbolize rope that had once been there, even if not there now. In affected Christian communities, you wouldn't find records of Jesus nailed to the cross, but instead hanged by the neck. However, when observing the work's creation, the Foundation noticed that the paint strokes of their studied subjects were not that of an artist, but a puppet. There was no noticeable muse guiding their hand down a path of creative discovery. There weren't even any pauses for reflection or wonder. The movements were precise but not inspired. The art seemed to be comprised of all wrist and no heart. So if these people really are puppets forced to perform, the question remains, who is our puppeteer? To find out, we have to follow the strings wherever they run and pull. And luckily, that isn't too hard, as all of them lead to the same instance, October 2012, when a densely populated 2221-A community in a small town, further referred to as POP 044221-A, undoubtedly exposed themselves as living under the influence of an anomalous force, immediately recognized as SCP-2221. In October of 2012, armed mobs attacked Foundation installations in the town. Site-614 swiftly contacted the O5 Council to report the incident. It was believed that these mobs were not just violent brutes looking to smash glass, but that their attacks had a more nuanced motive. Soon it was apparent that they had inside information concerning the Foundation, and they demand that the Foundation surrender several specific anomalies and mandate that 34 specific members of Foundation personnel to be put on trial. The October attacks were initially attributed to the Republic of Letters, a group of Foundation employees who believe that the public deserves to know the truth about what they do. The group quickly claimed responsibility for leaking information leading to the disaster. At this point, the Foundation was not yet aware of any major 2221-A populations, let alone POP 2221-A, and thus the Republic of Letters' claims were believed, at least until there was good reason to question them. Examination of computers at Site 614 revealed that many personnel had been using software hosting an instance of SCP-2221. The consensus within the Foundation then shifted to the belief that the leaked information came from Foundation personnel, having been subverted by the Friends of Amicus, the group behind SCP-2221. It remains unknown whether the failure to find and report this instance of SCP-2221 was due to negligence or deliberate sabotage. To find out, Site 614 personnel were detained for examination. Field agents from Site 115 and Site 621 were sent to the affected area under the command of Site Director Susan Pritchard to observe and report on the local 2221-A population, POP 0442221. Under the manipulation of an anomalous end-user license agreement, 2221-A's go to war with local prisons. And while we call it a war, they might call it a fight for justice, because in their mind, this onslaught is justified. But justified might be the wrong word here. It implies logic. But there is no discernible reasoning here. When POP 0442221 ambushes the cells of criminals, it's not for a reason, but rather an obligation. It is an order from elsewhere. These attacks don't look mechanical or robotic, yet there is a clear sense that buried within an impassioned rage is something enforcing it. The 2221-A's might be best compared to horses running a track. Surely they are by nature powerful animals who enjoy high speeds, but would they really act like this if not for the contrived structures of the Kentucky Derby? So this is to ask, who runs the fastest? The horse in the freedom of the fields, or the one being whipped? The answer presents itself to local security as they go head-to-head with the violent determination of SCP-2221-A's, led by their anomalous commander. It was a taxing battle, but the security forces were able to repel most of the attacks and limit the damage. However, prisons in the area didn't have such luck and were overrun by fervent mobs. Prisoners at both locations are dragged outside and murdered, even those prisoners who have committed the most minor of crimes. College students peer-pressured into petty vandalism found themselves sentenced to death by the hands of 2221-A's. Over the course of the next 4 months, even more drastic changes in the religious practices of the local Sunni Muslim majority were observed. Local mosques began announcing the call to prayer 8 times per day instead of the traditional 5. Decorative nooses were seen hanging in the doorways, often adorned with colorful cloth in elaborate patterns. Several imams believed to be instances of 2221-A are noted to add an additional prophet, Sadiq, to the traditional Islamic list of prophets. But when pressed for additional information on Sadiq, these imams act confused, and they deny knowledge of any such name. By April 2013, affected communities began sounding the call to prayer up to 30 times per day. With little time left for other activities, attacks on Foundation installations ceased. POP 0442221-A distributed print versions of the SCP-2221 contract, thereby converting nearly all adult members of affected communities into instances of 2221-A. The Foundation acted quickly. Field agents quarantined towns inhabited by POP 0442221-A, and unaffected civilians were evacuated into Foundation custody. The frequency of 2221-A calls to prayer continued to increase until prayer became constant among the entirety of POP 0442221-A. Between May 24th and June 6th, every known member of POP 0442221-A expired from exhaustion and dehydration, bringing the outbreak to a tragic end. The SCP Foundation was one of the organizations listed to Clause 217, along with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Republic of Letters, and several other groups of interest and governmental organizations. Personnel who have read Clause 217 were isolated and kept under examination. The addition had no discernible effect, least of all a literal one. It is believed that Clause 217 is merely a taunt rather than an info hazard or legally binding addition to the document. However, supervisors are to make weekly reports of the behavior of Foundation personnel who have read modified versions of Clause 217. Being turned into a murderous religious zealot is one thing, Being forced into an act of unpleasant self-coitus is quite another. Now go check out SCP-029 Daughter of Shadows and SCP-053 Young Girl for more anomalies that'll drive you to do terrible things.